Hello, good morning. It is Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, therefore it must be time for another teissTalk. My name is Jeff White. I'll be your host for today's teissTalk, as I am every Thursday morning at 10. Hello to our returning members here at teissTalk, our returning audience attendees, and welcome to you. If you're new, please do spread the word. We are discussing all of the key topics on these teissTalks every Thursday morning at 10, every Tuesday afternoon at 4. Which is my co-host Jenny Radcliffe's session. So yes, please do spread the word. And I am finally able to see all of the chat. Last time I couldn't see the chat window. So hello to all of you. You can use the chat window there to get in touch, to harangue us and give us abuse, or you can use the Q&A tab to ask questions. We'll put them to our panel, who today are going to be discussing threat management, passive, reactive and proactive threat management. Which would you do? Probably all three. So we're going to be talking to a great panel on this. We've got some really, really good people. Lee Howard is Head of IT Security, Risk and Shared Services at N Brown Group. And even if you haven't heard of N Brown Group, you've probably heard of some of the brands they represent in terms of clothing. Talking of that, we have Simon Goldsmith, who's Senior Director of Information Security at Adidas. And we have Matt Locke, who is Technical Director UK at Varonis. So we've got a fantastic panel coming up later on. I want to introduce, though, our first guest on this is going to be talking to us, who's been on teissTalk before a little while ago and is joining us again. Pleased to welcome Craig McEwen, who's Chief Information Security Officer at Anglo American. Craig, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, Jeff. How are you?
I'm all right. And yes, somebody's already pointed out that I'm not wearing a jacket and bow tie. Basically, I've moved house. The room that I'm now in is also the room that contains the boiler. And boy, that's not a pleasant experience at the moment. But in winter, hopefully, will be much more pleasant. But Craig, you're in the office. You've gone back in to work.
Yeah, I have, Jeff. Just one day a week. We've actually moved office, so that's been going on over lockdown, which has been interesting. And finally opened a few weeks ago in Farringdon. So just in one day a week to help get the place settled in before we start to open up to the rest of the team. We haven't set a date on that yet. It will probably be much later in the future, but it is nice to get back. It's nice to see the old faces, and it's nice just to have that variety in your day, whereas walking from your boiler room to your kitchen gets a bit repetitive after a while.
Yeah, I do appreciate that. And my life, to be honest, my life before lockdown was, days of just working at home. I relished the opportunity to go and visit people in their workplaces because it just broke the routine. It's a bit of normality. And then when everybody else was doing what I was doing and staying at home, my life got more and more. I got pushed down the weirdness spectrum. So, how was it? I mean, you're wearing work clothes? Have you got back, put the work shoes on and stuff?
Yeah. I didn't wear the suit jacket today because it's lovely outside. But yeah, trying to get back into that full normal routine. So in work clothes, we've got these really cool track and trace sort of electronic badges that flash colours if you get too close to people and things. So there's been a lot gone on behind the scenes in terms of making the office safe for people to come back to. So that's nice as well. But it's nice to see people in business attire. Again, it's a bit of normality.
Yeah, exactly. And how's been, just while we talk about this, how has it been setting up the SOC? Was that easier to do with everybody out? Because I know there's a lot of infrastructure work going on the roads and stuff while they're quieter. Was that the same for you guys? Like, get it done while nobody's here and it's going to be easier?
Yeah, exactly. So the moving of kit things, we have large safes where we keep digital forensic evidence and things. There's been a lot of humping and dumping. So could have used the extra hands for that side. But no, it's nice. Like, it'll be great because with my management team, we're setting things up how we want it to look. And when the teams come back in, it should be all nice, new, shiny, and set up purposely for them. So they'll come into a really nice environment as opposed to just now where there's still work going on and things. So it's hopefully it'll give the guys and girls a really nice workplace when they do come back. It should be pretty cool.
Yeah, good. It's going to be really interesting to that. And in terms of that, is there a plan at Anglo American for how often people will be in the office? What's the setup?
It's an interesting one. I've heard lots of debates about whether companies will mandate a minimum number of days, go back to 5 days, go fully remote working. I think within Anglo American, we're being very flexible with it. So we haven't drawn a line in the sand yet with days. Certainly my personal view is that sort of 2 days a week would be the minimum. It's nice to have people and it's nice to see people and sort of connect with each other physically. But we've definitely proven that remote working is a completely viable option in the corporate offices, of course, not in mine sites, obviously. So it would be silly to go back to the old ways, having been forced into this way of working as a result of COVID. So I think as a business, we'll probably maintain a high degree of flexibility. We won't be too sort of regulated on it. We won't start sort of telling people how and what to do, but we'll be very accommodating to suit people's needs. I think what lockdown's done is, for some people, is it's shown that actually working from home suits their lifestyles, take the kids to school, that sort of thing. For some other people, the more social butterflies, they absolutely need to be in that office environment and go to the coffee area and just chat with people. And so accommodating both those ends of the spectrum, I think, is really important to make sure we get that right balance for people.
Yeah, really interesting. It's going to be interesting. I think the pendulum swing over the next sort of 6 months is going to be really interesting in terms of, obviously, all the business I speak to are saying the same thing as you, flexibility. But it's going to be interesting to sort of say, okay, we've had some flexibility now. What do we think works? I suspect you'll start to see a concretization at some stage. John said, really challenging for lots of organisations with this return to the office, who to physically challenge for being there, etc. Yeah, which is really interesting. Really interesting. And so in terms of, I mean, let's move on to the sort of topic at hand, threat management. I find it interesting, in terms of where people get the sort of threat intelligence from, because obviously you can only manage the threats that you know about. And one of our speakers was sort of saying, Twitter is quite a good source for sort of threat management, that kind of thing. What's your sort of go-to sources for working out this stuff?
So we have multiple. I mean, Twitter is a handy one, especially for sentiment analysis. Trying to work out if you've upset a particular group of people. Twitter can be handy to see that. You can imagine, although Anglo American's a very responsible miner, you can imagine that there are groups who have views on mining as a whole, and typically they will start to voice things on Twitter. Some even have websites. I won't name them, I don't want people to go and visit them, but there are websites there for people who are against the idea of mining, and so we monitor those as well. I think we have lots of sources. I think that the thing about intelligence is, so it's a really interesting one. Intelligence is one of those things that you can shovel as much money and people and resources and time as you want into it and still actually generate nothing. One of the things that tends to be missed is the idea of an intelligence collection plan. What do we want to know? So what's important to us? What are we worried about? And so therefore, what do we want to collect against? What type of information do we want? And ultimately, these are driven by what we call critical intelligence requirements, effectively questions that we want to answer. And those inform what we need to collect. And that will help us choose what tools we use. If you don't have that intelligence collection plan, if you don't know what concerns your company, what concerns what you're ultimately trying to answer, like I said, you'll almost wheel spin in the sand, where you'll collect lots of good stuff and your analysts will produce lots of cool things. They won't really answer anything for anybody specifically, and so people won't engage with it, and ultimately you'll miss the important thing, which does concern your business. So that idea for collection plan is really important. I'd suggest that Twitter will probably feature in anybody's collection plan because of what it is. But when you look at the other types of tools, I'll give you a good example. Dark web monitoring. I used to work in critical national infrastructure, and within that area, there was lots of talk about SIM card sales. It was massive. I don't remember, about 5 to 7 years ago, there's this huge thing about SIM card pricing and a sort of cartel thing going on with SIM card manufacturers. There's a whole underbelly of criminality around SIM cards going on. And so for the organization I worked with, huge interest in dark web marketplaces, absolutely massive. In the mining industry, I'm very, touch wood, which just we've not found it, but there aren't many people selling tons of iron ore on the dark web. Diamonds, we tend to find their way on there, but most of our commodities don't go on the dark web. So from my perspective, although we do look at the dark web, it's not the most common source of information for us, because it's not doing anything that concerns us at this point in time. Now, we keep tabs on it. It's right to do that, but it doesn't feature highly in what we're looking at, because it just doesn't really impact our industry. And so when you have that collection plan, you start to then work out where you do need resources, technologies, and that does help the process a lot.
It's interesting when we're talking about this threat stuff, because there's this sort of sliding scale between targeted attacks. Somebody takes a dislike to Anglo American and decides they're going to go after you, and then the sort of spray and pray attacks and the sort of just bulk ransomware type attacks. It's interesting, when we're talking about threat, it seems to me that it just ends up focusing more on that kind of targeted attack. Because although there are threats from, the sort of spray and pray type approach, those threats are generalized across everybody's got those threats. When you're talking about threats, you're sort of ending up focusing more on those kind of targeted attacks. And what specifically about Anglo Americans should we worry about, correct?
I mean, they can be, Jeff. I think with the spray and pray attacks, though, there is still utility in trying to divert some intelligence resources and collection efforts into that area. When we bring this back to, if you consider sort of passive measures, which patching, I would consider patching as a passive measure. If you're patching your systems, it doesn't actively do anything, but it effectively closes the door. If you're looking at that and you're looking at generic spray and pray attacks, if you understand what ones are becoming flavor of the month, what are being spoken about a lot, what is likely to happen, in the next few weeks in terms of spray and pray attacks, you can then use that to influence your patching regime, your system upgrades, in terms of getting rid of legacy OSs, for example. So that can form a lot of those passive defenses, which can be immensely useful because I know there's some companies who are horrendously targeted because they're nice, juicy targets to nation states and big criminal groups. Banks are the best example. That's where all the money is, and most criminals want money, so banks are a good thing to go after. But when you consider most large multinational companies, even sort of SME companies, the biggest concern is those spray and pray attacks, getting caught out by an unlucky, indiscriminate attack and being turned over that way. And so, using intelligence to understand those spray and pray attacks and the sort of flow of the attack landscape is useful in informing the rest of your cyber defense strategy. If you have a cyber defense strategy, of course, if you're not doing active patching or anything like that, then obviously it's not something that you're going to be too concerned about. But if you are, it can become useful. Of course, the stuff's useful as well. Absolutely.
So that threat intelligence that you get about the sort of spray and pray end of stuff is useful because it informs the kind of, where you focus your passive measures like patching and so on. I'm trying to catch up on everything.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, it's, if you understand and this is, so to use a military analogy, you have this process called the 7 questions process. And this is what a commander will ask before he or she goes into combat effectively. And the first question is, what is the situation and how does it affect me? So what's going on and, how does that impact my forces? It's the same with network security. If you think, what is the situation, basically means what assets do I have? And how does it affect me? Where are they vulnerable? Where can they be impacted? And if you understand that, then you can really start to close down your access to attackers effectively through vulnerabilities, for example. And one of the key things with threat intelligence is if you know all your assets, so I have Schneider assets, I have Rockwell assets, I have Dell computers, I have this, that, the next thing. If I know them, I can create collection efforts, and this goes back to the intelligence collection plan. I can create collection efforts around Schneider. Anybody talking on criminal forums or on malware forums about Schneider systems. If I then start to see increased chatter on Schneider systems, we can then start to make some assessments of, is there a possibility of a future attack against Schneider systems? If there is, or we assess there to be, we can then look at our Schneider estate and say, right, are they okay? Are they up to date? Is there anything we need to do to make sure they're more secure? The thing is, that sounds like fairly obvious stuff, but you can't do that for everything you own as a business. It's too much. You'd need teams of thousands, and as much as we'd all love that, it's not realistic. So the reality is that you've got to use that threat intelligence to pinpoint the stuff where you need to move your resources to. It's a bit like a game of chess. You've got a finite number of pieces, and you need to move them very strategically, otherwise you'll expose yourself. It's the same as cybersecurity. If you try and tackle all the issues, if you try and patch everything, for example, you're probably going to get into a bad place, burn your staff out, they'll get annoyed, they'll leave, you won't have enough capacity. So you need to be really clinical about, right, these things aren't important just now because nobody's talking about them, nobody's using them, let's ignore it, park it. These things the criminals are looking at just now, so let's go deal with that. And that makes things a bit easier to make sense of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And presumably there's a defensibility aspect to this. In terms of obviously you're as a C-level executive, you're presumably involved with the board, and presumably at some stage you have to say to them, look, here is what we are tackling. Here are the things I don't think that we need at the moment to tackle because we're not getting the intelligence that those are threats that are coming over the hill, basically.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, it's the board tends to like to talk about things in terms of risk, typically in RAG status, so red, amber, green. And by using that threat intelligence, you can actually talk very easily about risk. So if you're not seeing any information about system X at all, you can make an assessment, and this is all assessment based, so you can't change obviously, but you can make that assessment. Is that screen just now? Nobody's interested, nobody's doing anything, nothing's happening. However, this type of system is being hit all the time. There's loads of news articles about it. We've seen some forums where they're talking about a particular vulnerability they want to start exposing. So therefore, that can then move to red. And so it does facilitate that easy board conversations. The board doesn't want to hear about, well, not, it depends on the board, of course, but boards typically don't want to hear about metrics. They don't want to hear about, we have 400 attacks a month, we defend 300 and 100 we have to resolve. They just want to look very high level at the risk profile, the threat landscape, and understand that, first of all, that you understand where the risks are, and secondly, what measures you're taking to address and mitigate those risks. So it does really facilitate that conversation quite well.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And obviously, we've had talks on teissTalks about CISOs and boards and how to manage that kind of conversation, which is something that comes up and up and up. Just before we bring on our panel, I want to talk about, because obviously, you talked about sort of more passive threat management, talked about a bit more proactive threat management. It's also active threat management. And you mentioned before we came on about the idea of the sort of hackback tactics and what's coming down in the US. Have a chat about that. How do you regard what the US is looking at doing?
This is a fantastic conversation. What is active defense? If you look on sort of academic journals and any news sites, you'll see there's quite a lively debate about what is actually active defense. And in America, they have this. It's the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act. I don't think it's actually come into force yet, but it's certainly been sort of bandied about, and it's colloquially known as hackback, as you said, Jeff. And it's the idea that if you are attacked, you are entitled to then react to that attack and do something to the attacker. An example would be to place a beacon on the attacker's system, so when they go back online, you can see them and you can start to get information about them. There are some controls in it. For example, if you're going to hack back, what they're saying, America's saying, is that you'd have to get authority from the FBI to do it. But it's a fascinating question, because there's two key things here in my mind. First of all, it blurs the lines between law enforcement and private sector. If we're allowed to go after the bad guys aggressively, then what's law enforcement's role? In traditional sense, if someone breaks into your house, you can defend yourself in the house, but as soon as they leave your house, you in the UK certainly, you shouldn't chase after them because you've then gone from defending yourself to actually chasing them, and you can end up in jail. We've seen cases of people before shooting thieves who have run out of the house and then going to jail. So at what point does it separate? Well, where's the separation from law enforcement to private companies? The second one is, if you start to do that, what's the chances of retaliation? If you go after a nation state who attacks you, do you just open up the doors and say, well, let's have a spat here? And if it does, then where does that lead? So it's risky. It's a fascinating idea, and certainly in my mind, something more needs to be done globally in terms of how we tackle cyber crime. I'm not quite sure if private sector riding off on horses and shooting pistols at the bad guys is the way to go. But I'm not saying it's not. I'm not sure.
It is an interesting debate, and as the devil is always in the detail. Folks who are watching, if you've got views on this, please feel free to stick them in the chat. I'd be interested to see what you think. We will, in the future, hopefully be able to run polls, so we can do a poll on this kind of thing. But let us know your thoughts on the old hacking back issue. Jose, forgive me, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but has asked a question about cyber insurance, which I'll come on to in our chat with our panelists. I'm going to bring on our other panelists now to have a chat with us. We have, as I say, Lee Howard, who's head of IT security, risk and shared services at N Brown Group. We have Simon Goldsmith, who's senior director info security at Adidas, and Matt Locke, who is technical risk director at UK at Varonis. Welcome to you all. Lee, can I come to you first of all? Because I say N Brown, maybe not a name that rings bells itself, but what brands do you guys run?
Yeah, absolutely. So N Brown is effectively the umbrella group. We've got about 5 or 6 power brands. I think the most popular brands that people are most aware of is JD Williams, Giacomo, and Simply Be. So an old company, over 130 years old. Previously catalog, and now we're in the digital world of retail.
Yeah, because it grew out of the big catalog boom in the whatever it was, 1920s or whatever. There was the catalog shopping became really, really important. It's interesting. It's also you guys do. I was quite impressed because you guys do. There's a big emphasis on sort of plus size and diverse size. Like if you're bigger than the average size or smaller than the average size, you guys have lots of outlets for that. I thought it's quite cool to see that.
Yeah, it's all about for us. It's serving the underserved customer, I suppose. and an all-inclusive approach to shoppers and retail. And I think people trying to do that these days in a less tangible digital, buy and return the clothes, it's less and less available these days for those type of shoppers. So yes.
And you're not high street, you're just online, is that right?
Yeah, 100% online. So we did have bricks and mortar until about 3 or 4 years ago, which we decided to shut down. Clearly, the events over the last 12, 18 months, that was a great strategic decision to take.
Yeah. Good stuff. Thanks for that, Lee. It's good. Simon, my first question for you, Simon, actually is Adidas or Adidas? I've never known which. Go on.
It tends to depend on which side of the Atlantic you are. That's my experience anyway, but it's Adidas. That's how I've always pronounced it.
Adidas, got it. Yes, yeah, and it probably needs no introduction that particular thing. But in terms of, there's obviously, I know Adidas as a manufacturer, and obviously I see their products being sold in shops. To what extent is also Adidas selling directly? How much of a part of Adidas is that?
Well, that's a very good question. That's probably our biggest strategic objective right now, is to shift more of our business to direct to consumer. With a target of it being 50% by 2025, and obviously digital is kind of a big part of that. And there's a big kind of digital transformation that needs to go on, kind of at the front end with customers and consumers, but also with the supply chain.
Yeah, of course. What's driving that shift? 'Cause that's a big shift to make. What's the sort of factors influencing?
There's some really strong financial drivers around. It's more profitable. It's we're more able to control the experience and interaction with the brand, and it's deliver greater value to the consumer through that kind of interface.
It's interesting as well, particularly in clothing and particularly in trainers, there's this whole customization thing as well. And, I presume that's part of it, that you can actually order direct from the manufacturer and you can potentially customize the thing if you're ready to pay a bit more.
Yeah, there's that. There's also the hype. That's kind of a big part of our business is ramping up customer demand and appetite for the brand through hype sales, so limited edition trainers and kind of hype drops, as we call them. I didn't know what a Yeezy was before I joined the company, but I certainly do now. So working with kind of big brands and influencers is all part of that picture.
My cousin's kid got into this whole drop shipping business and buys these pairs of trainers, which frankly to me look hideous, but there's huge demand for them. And I think he had 200 quid from his paper round money, and he's now got 2.5 grand, and he's actually blogging.
Well, it's playing a small part, but it's big business. The whole resale market for limited edition trainers or sneakers, if you're on the side of the Atlantic, I think it's something like 6 billion in the next couple of years. It's a big market, surprisingly big market.
Yeah, indeed. For somebody who wears brogues most of the time, we couldn't mark it up complete divorce from that. There you go.
It's part of the attraction of the job was going to work in t-shirts and trainers. It's got to be
exactly. Yeah. Matt, let's come to you first. Come to you next. Varonis. I've come across at conferences, but just for our attendees, describe sort of in basic terms, what Varonis does.
In basic terms, Varonis is a software security company that provides a data security platform. So we primarily monitor and allow organizations to understand risks associated with unstructured data. So whether it resides in a data center or in a cloud repository, and the big thing for us now and our future is taking in multiple pieces of telemetry to provide behavioral analytics, understanding behavior, understanding roles and privilege, to help make a decision that something may have gone awry and warrants some level of investigation.
Right. Okay. So you've got a bunch of stuff on your server. Your software will kind of work out what it is and ideally who should get access to it. So.
Exactly. Yes. And also the behavior and how typically people interact with that information and where they come from and roles and peer relationships and all of these good attributes that allow us to make a decision about whether we should look at an alert or investigate something.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. And yeah, obviously for the insider threat, which is another issue we've discussed a lot on teissTalk, it's really useful. Ian, by the way, I've got your question there about ransomware. We'll look at the questions in a bit. But I just want to come firstly on to Simon, because when we were chatting about this in preparation, you had a really interesting sort of approach, quite a hard-headed approach to threats and what you took seriously and what you didn't. In terms of Adidas, what's on your radar, and what are you thinking? No, that's actually not something I want to talk about.
Yeah, it's an interesting angle. I was listening to Craig talk about that difference between APT and kind of the spray and hope kind of, or the kind of the large scale attacks. And I kind of knew when I joined Adidas, I'm formerly in financial services and national security, and one of my colleagues actually was the first one to reverse engineer the Bank of Bangladesh malware that appeared on the printer. So kudos on that podcast, by the way. It's outstanding, Jeff. Really fantastic.
Sergey Shevchenko, was that?
Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to, side issue, but the podcast, I made a podcast with the BBC all about this Bangladesh bank hack, which you probably all know about. And I wanted to interview Sergey for it. And he said he moved on. He couldn't speak about it. It was a shame because his blog about that was absolutely amazing.
It's outstanding, yeah.
Worked, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Side point.
So when I joined Adidas, and I was full of all these great ideas of how we deploy threat intelligence for a big brand and help you and use threat intelligence to drive up maturity. So kind of looking beyond the typical instant management use of threat intelligence and more kind of tactical and strategic use cases for it and that sort of thing. And the CISO at the time kind of sat me down and said, look, that's great, but we've got a whole maturity journey to go on, and anticipating what threats we might face is a much lower priority than actually dealing with the threats that we have.
Right.
And not being overwhelmed by those. And so our threat landscape is kind of as you'd expect particularly for kind of a big e-com. We've got the kind of the mage cart type attackers. We've got, the Fin 7, Fin 8s. We got the guys, and I forget their name, who attack the Euro 2020s and go after other kind of online portals. And then we've also got the Lazarus group who've kind of hopped on the bandwagon and starting to do kind of mage cart style kind of attacks.
Really?
I think they hit Claire's Accessories was the publicised one. So we've got that kind of range of attackers that are quite targeted. The ones that I guess are specific to only 2 companies on the planet are the sneakerheads. And it's a really interesting space. It looks like they developed completely separately from other threat groups, but the tactics they deploy are very similar to those that are doing kind of ticket scalping and skimming and kind of reserving lotteries for these limited edition sneakers. So they're using kind of similar techniques and tactics, but developed completely separately, and not always malicious, or not always necessarily a threat, right? It's part of the hype game.
Yeah.
So the way that we've got to look at those is a little bit more nuanced than just looking at them as kind of bad actors. But I guess they'd be our equivalent of ATP.
Really interesting. You've got a lot of stuff in common with Ticketmaster in that case, the mage cart stuff, and also the kind of hyping, getting
and skimming, and that's again, and again with kind of the Ticketmaster, they've got positive and negative sides to bot attacks, because to an extent they want to stop scraping of their website, but to an extent it is also part of their business model. So
indeed.
There's some interesting dynamics there.
Lee, let's come to you now on that, because it's a similar sort of sector, but presumably a bit less of the stuff that Simon was talking about in terms of, you're not doing kind of drop sales of a particular type of trader. You've got lots of brands that you're trying to manage all at the same time. But what sort of stuff are you seeing? What's key on your radar?
Yeah, I think it's a slightly different scenario that Simon would face. I think I'm not doing my company a disservice by saying Giacomo is not as well of a known brand as Adidas, for example. So therefore, previously, and I'd say prior to COVID, we was not suffering from more targeted attacks because we were probably in that category of lesser known brands. I think what COVID and the prevalence of cyber and cyber actors and retailers effectively completely moving online has done is increase the type of attacks that we would typically see, but just the prevalence of it, the efficiency of it, how it's getting delivered, where it's getting delivered from has just increased exponentially. So I think maybe previously we may have dipped below the radar, so to speak, on some types of attacks. I think now, like many other medium-sized, less-known companies, are probably having to ramp up their maturity posture in reaction to the world that's changed post-COVID now.
Yeah, and presumably also because of this shift away from bricks and mortar and high street presence towards online, that's why folks like you are increasingly, working for M Brown Group, because it's all online. So there's the IT security has to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I look at it from an internal and external perspective. Our corporate network, we've seen an increase in those attacks. So how do we react to these type of attacks? Phishing's gone up 800%, for example. I don't think that's specific to my business. I think it's just a general trend. Yeah, and it's interesting as well, actually, because it gets back to similarly what Craig was saying. Is what is the situation? How does it affect me? Well, use that as an example. It affects me just as much as it always has done, right? But what does the situation mean? Well, it's getting more prevalent. Right. We know the controls are working and we can demonstrate that, but the likelihood of an event unfolding increases. So you have to react to that, I suppose. And it gets back to what we're saying about how we're doing that threat management. So even just something as simple as that, a reaction would be over-index on the internal colleague engagement and training and awareness for phishing scams, for example, things like that. So it's been interesting. And then similar with the from an account perspective, retailers, broadcasters, BBC, Netflix, things like that, and financial companies are heavily targeted for account takeover attacks. So reused credentials compromised elsewhere in the internet, and it's just credential stuffing, slam dunks, trying to get into people's accounts and brute forcing the way through there. So we've seen a massive increase on that aspect.
With that phishing, I mean, that's an amazing statistic, 800% increase in phishing. Is there a commensurate rise then in the number of people who fall for those phishing attacks? Or can you have a big increase in phishing attempts, but actually that doesn't translate necessarily over into compromise?
I think that's it, Jeff, because we almost put all our eggs into the technical security controls basket and then hope that will save the day, right? If you're talking about tens of thousands of attempts on a monthly basis, yes, the majority all will get stopped. But I think as that figure is just increased, that there is a natural likelihood that only one, and I saw the question on the ransomware, for example, only one needs to get through the technical controls, right? So then this is where we need to fall back to our defense in depth measures. People are that last line of defense, and we have to engage with our colleagues. So it's just things like that, and just reacting to what you're seeing in an appropriate fashion.
Can I come on to you now, Matt? It's interesting the way that the Varonis stuff works. I can imagine, any organization of any size, whatever the threats, can sort of deploy your software and it'll do its job and they'll get the insights, in terms of what their data is and who should have access to it and what the behavior patterns are. So to what extent are you even concerned about different threats? Presumably, I can see a situation where it's like, well, whatever the threat is, we can help out. To what extent does those different threats guide what you guys do for your clients?
I think they do guide us to some degree. I think we've seen and we've investigated so many incidences over the last 18 months, and a lot of them follow. I mean, we know they follow typical patterns of activity. We know the types of reconnaissance that they run. We know that they try and laterally move. We know that they try and do some sort of discovery and potential exfiltration, all of these things. So the way that we typically try and tackle it is by looking at behavior that resembles those types of techniques. So we try and stay reasonably agnostic to specific threats. Obviously, when we see, for example, a payload being dropped and a certain executable that's been named, or perhaps a piece of ransomware that gets created, and then text files and extensions that get, obviously we would be mad not to include them in the platform and be quite proactive, but we try and be agnostic as we can, and it really benefits us because we're looking at behavior at the end of the day, and if I can identify particular accounts that are associated with particular devices, and then I start to see those accounts suddenly accessing devices that aren't within typical patterns of behavior, and also peers don't seem to behave that way as well, that gives us a very good indication that there's something that's gone awry, and then we can start to dive into it to actually find out what's going on. It's proving to be quite successful, really, to be able to be quite we're being alerted quite early. for example, with things like the Exchange proxy that came out recently, and also the SolarWinds and other ones, and dark side as well, we were able to detect that type of stuff by looking at the way that service accounts were suddenly behaving in a way that they don't typically behave. And different accounts have different roles and different privileges, but they certainly have different pieces, different types of behavior. And so that's typically what we see early on.
Yeah, interesting stuff. We've had a few questions come through, and I'm going to pop a couple of them up, hopefully on screen, if I can work out how to do this. John T. Rhodes has asked, in broad terms, are the panelists finding threat management? If I can come to you with this first, actually, Craig. In broad terms, are you finding threat management easier, harder, or the same with hybrid working? What's been your experience?
It's an interesting one, actually, and sorry to touch on what Matt's been talking about. It's become, in some ways, it's stayed fairly static in terms of external sort of look in terms of the threat landscape, but internally, then that ability to look and understand it has the threats increase exponentially. Simple things as printing at home. Windows 10 doesn't need printer drivers installed anymore, which is wonderful. It makes printing much easier. But it also makes it easier for people to print stuff. As soon as it's printed, we've lost control of it effectively. Who can see the screen? Who can hear conversations? We have an effective apprenticeship program at Anglo American. Some of our apprentices are on Teams calls, and their mother or father walks in, and that's really benign. But actually, if you're talking about something operationally, do you want someone external to be hearing about that? Of course, they might talk about it over dinner, so you can't really control that. So those things really have brought in an interesting dynamic. I'm always wary of saying that it's bad. Although it is bad, and although it does increase the risk to the business, I'm wary of saying it is truly bad, because if we do, the likelihood is we'll run away from it and we'll go back to everybody in the office after a couple of years. I think it's incumbent on us as security professionals to establish the middle ground between risk tolerance and sort of risk avoidance, because we have to accept there is a new way of working, and it's a good thing, but we also have to acknowledge that it does bring these threats. But what we can't do is just close the door on them. I think that would be a shame if we'd done that. Having done 18 months of remote working, if we just go back to lots of companies saying, no, in the office, then that'd be a shame. Finance is the best example of that, dealing with people's accounts remote. Where is the middle ground on that? I'm not from finance, I don't really know, but it's an interesting question.
It's a good one. I want to come to you, Lee, on this, because one thing I didn't realise about M. Brown is you're also a credit provider, which again goes back ages. I mean, the JD Williams were a credit provider back in the day for people, but that gives you an extra onerous responsibility, but also for working from home. You're not just taking sort of sales calls, you're also taking payments and extending credit to people and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we went into what I refer to as a dislocated setup, we had to really look at our architectural design and secure by design approach of how we do those things. So as a regulated business by the FCA, and obviously we have PCI compliance standards that we need to beat. Challenges just came out of nowhere. How do you control the physical environment once they leave the physical environment, for example? So then we had to really step up and ramp up technical controls that were applicable when you was, for want of a better word, on the LAN. We then need to change our whole design posture to mitigate any potential risks, and then having pretty robust conversations with the board in terms of we can do what we can do, but then you get into that very murky water of getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? So it's and this is where the whole risk management process really kicked into gear at that point. What is the risk over the reward? Clearly, you've got compliance red lines that you can't cross, so we need to demonstrate that we're meeting them. Really challenging time that initial 3 months, certainly. How understanding were government and the regulators around that? Because obviously you're trying to have conversations with the regulators and say, look,
really good question. Yeah, really good question, Jeff. If I look at two main regulators in my space, so the FCA and the ICO, for example, two completely different tones that were coming out initially from the regulators. The ICO, this is subjective to me, but the ICO's tone was, we understand the situation that people are facing, and it's almost a best endeavour, do what you can do and demonstrate you're doing what you can do. The FCA's tone was rather much more robust. which is interesting because we are a smaller business to like Barclays, for example, who are going to clearly have much more robust controls in place and greater maturity. So yeah, very differing views from two key regulators.
Interesting stuff. There's one here for you, Simon, that I'd like to ask. Martin Hopkins asked a question regarding threats that are targeted specifically at two companies in the world, yourself and the other that shall remain nameless. Are you sharing intelligence between the two targets? Tricky one. How does that work?
Not yet, but we've had conversations about doing that. There's banks do it. Other competitors in other industries do it. I don't see any reason why we couldn't share some sort of information.
Oh, I've got it.
I mean,
I think we lost you a little bit.
Threat is also they're also part of the, as I say, part of the hype game. We might not. Okay. Sorry about that. So
I can hear you now. Yes, carry on. Sorry.
The threats of broadband in deepest, darkest Peckham. So I think on those specific threats, which aren't necessarily threats. So they're part of the hype game. They're also benefit both of our businesses. We might not share the details on that, but there's no reason why we couldn't share broader kind of threat landscapes and intel on the kind of the threats facing sports retail businesses, because other businesses do it in other sectors, and so there's no reason why we couldn't, I don't think.
It's interesting, although the difference obviously being in banks, there are the big four, the big six, depending how you measure it. It's an interesting situation when there's two of you. I wish you best of luck with that.
Yeah, well, there's a maturity journey. Again, it's part of that kind of maturity curve, and Craig spoke about the collection plan and that sort of thing. I think there is a bit of a risk, those of us who've worked in different sectors and potentially more mature sectors, to assume slightly more of a role than we should. So we talked about that blurring of law enforcement and private. Actually, we are private businesses, right? And we're the security team in a private business. So we really should think about this from what are we there to do from a business perspective, and then what is appropriate from a security perspective, and getting our threat intel program to a certain level of maturity where we really understand our own threat landscape and really understand how that affects our business probably needs to happen before we start sharing.
Indeed, interesting. Matt, can I come to you just in the closing sort of minutes of this? I mean, obviously you've worked with various different clients, and you've probably seen a fair amount of sort of threat management programs and threat intelligence and so on. Have you got sort of key advice that you give to folks in this particular area when you come in? What are you looking for in terms of what's your threat intel, what's your threat management setup?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really does vary depending on the organisation that we're working with. We're very much come from the ethos that we really try and help reduce what we call the blast radius, for want of a better term. I mean, we've been involved in a number of instances over the last few months where had we not undertaken some preventative controls to reduce the potential impact, it would have been far worse. And we've seen that, and we've seen tangible evidence for that. So we always start from the beginning and just do an assessment of what the landscape looks like, what the level of overexposure is, how accounts and privileged roles are being utilised in the organisation, and just try and put some good governance in place. We're quite lucky in the sense that whilst all that's happening, we're learning about behaviour, we're learning about roles. So there's a certain, you could argue there's a little bit of a comfort blanket while we're sort of prepping and trying to fix the environment, but we really try and spend a lot of our time just trying to reduce that overexposure and just make sure that there's good controls in place in terms of behaviour and roles and how people generally get access to the information, and it will pay off immeasurably in the event of a breach, and we've seen it time and time again.
Good stuff. Thanks, Matt, for that. I'm aware time is ticking down, and apologies. We had a few questions come in. Ian, Chris, Simon, Jose, apologies to get around to your questions, but also a lot of them on ransomware. We've had other sessions on teissTalk and ransomware, which you can find on the website, but just a continuingly fascinating topic, that one. I want to thank our panelists for today's session. Really interesting chat with all of you guys. And I've lost my notes. Craig McEwen, Chief Information Security Officer, Anglo American. Lee Howard, Head of IT Security, Risk and Shared Services, N Brown Group. Simon Goldsmith, Senior Director, Information Security at Adidas, and of course Matt Locke, Technical Director, UK at Varonis. Thanks, chaps. It was a really interesting discussion. Folks, come back next Tuesday afternoon at 4. My colleague Jenny Radcliffe is back in the chair, and she'll be talking about steps towards zero trust digital identity life cycles with Sarah Armstrong-Smith, who's Chief Security Advisor at Microsoft. Always a fascinating chat with that. So yes, tune in at 4. I'll be back next week at 10. Have a great rest of the week, and if you're in the UK, enjoy a bit of the sun. Take care. Nice to see you all. Cheerio.
Thank you,
Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye-bye.